Imagine waking up in a city where the sun rises through giant crystals, where horseless carriages move, and where the laws of physics seem to bend to human will. This isn't fantasy. It isn't fiction. If Atlantis truly existed, it was both the pinnacle of human civilization and its greatest nightmare. A society so advanced it would make our smartphones seem like primitive toys, but with a price tag so high you wouldn't survive a single day. An empire built on secrets that, if revealed today, would completely rewrite our history. And it all began with something modern science is still desperately trying to understand. If you think you're prepared for any challenge, wait until you discover why the most powerful civilization in history vanished without a trace. But before I tell you about this lost civilization, you need to understand what life would be like in Atlantis. Imagine a world without clear borders, where the sea dictated the pace of life, and there were no GPS or digital maps to guide you. A time when 5,000 years ago, while the Egyptians were building their first pyramids and Kunai writing was just beginning in Mesopotamia, Atlantis would have already been a resplendent metropolis. Most historians today ridicule the idea, calling it a Platonic myth. But underwater evidence near Santorini and mysterious structures in the depths of the Bahamas have rebellious archaeologists questioning our timeline. And if Plato wasn't inventing, but preserving a real account transmitted by Egyptian priests, possibly located in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean or perhaps in the Mediterranean Sea, Atlantis wouldn't have been just another city-state. It would have been the center of a trade network that controlled sea routes that not even the Phoenicians dared to explore. Mastery of the sea would have given them control over resources no other civilization could access. Here's the crucial point. 90% of the Atlantean population wouldn't have lived in the palaces of crystal and gold described in the myths. Most would be fishermen, artisans, and common laborers living in circular stone houses on the outskirts of the concentric rings that formed the capital. You would wake before sunrise like Arion, a 35-year-old fisherman who every morning took his boat, clad in a light and resistant metal unknown to us today, to search for giant schools of fish in the deep ocean. Meanwhile, in the central zones, the Atlantean elite would live a completely different reality. Agene Malura, a 22-year-old priestess, would wake in her blue marble chambers, bathing in water purified by a hydraulic system that Paris would only discover millennia later, wearing fabrics so light they seemed to float on the skin. You wouldn't have a cell phone, but you would have something potentially more efficient. A communication system based on synchronized crystals that would allow instant messaging across vast distances. There would be no cars, but transportation. Platforms powered by forces we would now call electromagnetism would whisk you through the city's rings at speeds that would make our subway seem like a turtle. And here's the most fascinating and terrifying part. While most ancient civilizations struggled to feed their populations, the Atlanteans developed agricultural techniques so advanced that famine was virtually unknown. Fields irrigated by concentric canals, greenhouses built with special crystals that amplified sunlight, and cultivation techniques that today would be at the height of bioengineering. But there was a hidden price for this abundance: the constant pressure to keep society functioning, the caste system so rigid that a born fisherman could never aspire to become a crystal engineer, and most importantly, a total dependence on technology that would render any modern person completely unprepared to survive there. Because in Atlantis, you wouldn't just need to understand technology, you would need to understand its magic. And it was this fine line between advanced science and inexplicable power that defined Atlantean technology. While we today depend on silicon and electricity, the Atlanteans mastered something far more powerful and dangerous: the manipulation of crystals and the Earth's natural energy fields. We're not talking about mystical crystals from esoteric stores, but perfect geometric conductors that channeled energies that modern physics still struggles to comprehend. Atlantean technology wasn't made of metal and screws. It was organic, fluid, almost alive. Imagine arriving home and your lights turning on, not through facial recognition, but by recognizing your own energetic frequency. Keon, a 40-year-old crystal engineer, didn't use tools as we know them. He synchronized his own energy with the crystals through breathing and mental techniques trained since childhood. A single lapse in concentration could result in devastating explosions. Atlantean buildings would defy our understanding of architecture. 30-story buildings supported not only by their foundations, but by force fields generated by master crystals installed underground. Walls that changed opacity depending on the sun's position. Materials that self-repaired by absorbing elements from the environment. For those accustomed to static concrete and fragile glass, it would be like entering a living organism. The average Atlantean family, like that of Elisha, a 37-year-old healer, would live in an environment that would make our smart home seem like cave technology. Their average home would have precise temperature and humidity control without visible devices. Purified water would flow through mineral-lined canals that not only transported, but also revitalized the liquid. The sewage system would not only dispose of waste, but would transform everything into fertilizer through alchemical processes that would leave no odor or contamination. In her healing center, Elisha would not use medicines as we know them. She would utilize crystalline resonance chambers that realigned the patient's energy field. Wounds that today would take weeks to heal would be cured in days. Illnesses that today require invasive surgeries would be treated with precision, without cutting. But this knowledge was tightly controlled by the healer caste. Sharing it with outsiders was punishable by exile or death. But the most extraordinary story comes from Talon, a 19-year-old apprentice at the Crystal Engineering Academy. During his third year of studies, Talon accidentally discovered that certain crystals, when aligned in specific patterns, could alter the very density of matter. Heavy objects could float. Stones became malleable like clay. He took his discovery to the Council of Wise Men, dreaming of recognition. Instead, he was warned in stern terms never to research that line of knowledge. Again, why? Because it was precisely this technology that enabled Atlantis's greatest wonders and its greatest secret. Atlantean energy sources would make our nuclear power plants seem primitive. While today we debate fossil fuels versus renewable energy, the Atlanteans had mastered what we can only call point energy, the ability to draw power from the very convergence points of the Earth's magnetic field. Crystal towers, strategically positioned along geodesic lines, captured and amplified these energies. The entire civilization operated without smoke, without toxic waste, but with constant and terrible risk. The Atlantean transportation system was equally revolutionary. There were no wheels as a basis for locomotion. Instead, polished stone platforms glided on tracks of unknown metal, levitating slightly above the surface. There was no visible engine, only pulsating crystals embedded in the sides. The Atlanteans didn't need fuel. They understood how to manipulate gravity. This same technology allowed seagoing vessels to cross oceans in days, not weeks, defying winds and currents. The communication system would be the most disturbing to us, modern smartphone addicts. The Atlanteans didn't need devices to communicate over distances. They used synchronized crystals. When you manipulated one, its counterpart reacted instantly, regardless of the distance. Trained messengers encoded information through sequences of touches and movements. It was like a wireless telegraph, operating through what we would now call quantum entanglement. But this marvelous technology had a dark side. The more it advanced, the more it required the extraction of rare minerals. The more powerful it became, the more instability it caused in the natural energy fields. And while the elite perfected new wonders in their crystal laboratories, something terrible began to happen deep within the Earth, beneath the resplendent Atlantis. The technology that elevated civilization to the pinnacle of power would be the same one that would dig its grave. And the first signs were already appearing, ignored by almost everyone. And while the crystal laboratories continued to create wonders, the first signs of disaster were already manifesting. It all began with something almost imperceptible, micro-tremors, not enough to knock objects off shelves, just enough to make the water in the canals ripple slightly. Most Atlanteans didn't even notice. The few who did received the same reassuring response from the high priests. Normal adjustments in the energy fields, nothing to worry about. Mercan, a 45-year-old Phoenician merchant, recorded in his travel journal something that the Atlanteans themselves had grown accustomed to ignoring. For the third night in a row, Strange lights danced over the crystal towers. The locals say it's common, but their expressions betray concern. Animals are restless. Migratory birds depart out of season. Something in the very atmosphere seems charged, as before a great storm that never arrives. The city's canals, once crystal blue, began to display a faint greenish glow. Water engineers increased the amount of purifying minerals, explaining that it was merely a passing algal bloom. But a young woman from the farming caste noticed that the plants irrigated with this water were growing deformed with twisted leaves and bitter fruit. When she tried to alert her supervisor, she was quickly silenced and transferred to another session. As the tremors increased in frequency, cracks began to appear in the outlying buildings. Nothing structural, just thin cracks in walls and floors. The official response came swiftly. A new decree ordering all buildings to be reinforced with special metal alloys, produced exclusively by the metallurgist caste. The cost, a 30% increase in taxes. The already overburdened working classes began to murmur. In the 11th year of the reign of Poseidones I, the first undisguised event occurred. During a solstice ceremony, with thousands gathered in the central square, the great crystal tower of the main temple emitted a pulse of energy so intense that it shattered every window within a half-kilometer radius. Dozens died, hundreds were injured. The official explanation: sabotage by spies from jealous kingdoms. The city gates were closed. Control over the population intensified. Yaret, a 60-year-old fisherman who spent more time at sea than in the city, reported something disturbing to his family. The currents are changing. Where once we sailed safely, now there are whirlpools. The ocean floor is shifting. His reports were dismissed as an old man's exaggerations. 2 weeks later, his boat had not returned. Social tensions escalated along with the natural phenomena. The workers in the crystal mines, exposed daily to unstable energies, began to fall ill with never-before-seen symptoms: skin peeling off in shiny patches, hallucinatory visions, and accelerated aging. When they organized a strike, the royal guard intervened with unprecedented violence. The event was erased from official records, but stories spread through the alleys and taverns. In the central laboratory, where the most brilliant engineers worked, a young assistant named Vexa made an alarming discovery. The master crystals, responsible for the city's energetic stability, were developing microscopic fissures. Worse, they were emitting radiation never before measured. Vexa presented his findings to the High Council and was found dead the next day, officially of natural causes. His report was shelved. The external channels connecting the city's rings to the ocean began to bubble with sulfuric gases. Fish turned up dead by the hundreds. The official explanation changed 3 times in 1 week. First, a toxic algal bloom, then an accidental spill of crystal waste. Finally, deliberate poisoning by foreign enemies. The population no longer knew what to believe. In the royal palace, as the crisis intensified, the unthinkable occurred: a split within the Supreme Council itself. One group, led by the High Priest Atlan, insisted that the crystal systems should be shut down immediately to allow the natural energy fields to stabilize. The other group, led by the king himself, argued that only more could correct the imbalances, that the solution was to build even larger master crystals, extract more energy, expand control. The king won the debate. The crystal mines now operated day and night. New towers were erected in record time. The city's glow intensified to such a point that, it is said, it could be seen across the ocean. Energy drains reached levels never before attempted. For a few weeks it seemed to work. The tremors subsided, the waters cleared. A false sense of security spread. Then the unthinkable happened. In the deepest mine, while extracting a crystal of unprecedented size, workers drilled into a hidden chamber. What they found there was never officially recorded. Witnesses spoke of a seemingly bottomless abyss pulsing with its own light. Others spoke of structures that seemed older than Atlantis itself. The hole was immediately sealed, and armed guards were stationed. 3 days later, the largest earthquake ever felt shook the entire city. This was no longer a crisis that could be hidden or controlled. It was the beginning of the end. The catastrophe that would define Atlantis forever was about to unfold. In all its relentless fury, that earthquake was not just a natural event, it was as if the Earth itself were rejecting Atlantean civilization. It began at 4:13 a.m., while most citizens were still asleep. The first tremor lasted 67 seconds, long enough to topple the statues of the central temple and crack the main aqueducts. But that was only the prelude to the horror. At 4:27 a.m., the second tremor, twice as strong, woke even the deepest sleepers. The master crystals, designed to absorb and redistribute energy, began to overload. Witnesses described the night sky lit by beams of blue and red light shooting from the towers into the clouds. The famous fountains in Plaza Real reversed their flow, shooting water more than 100 feet into the air. The family of Laurel, a 42-year-old mid-level engineer, was among the first to try to escape. He woke his 2 children and wife, grabbed a bag with emergency crystals and important documents, and ran to the nearest transportation platform. But the systems were already failing. The platforms, normally silent and efficient, swayed dangerously, or didn't move at all. "Let's walk," he shouted to his family as the ground shook beneath their feet. They never reached the outer gates. At 5:09 a.m., the third and most devastating tremor struck. It lasted 3 minutes and 18 seconds, enough time for the outer ring of the city, home to over 60,000 people, to literally sink 2 meters. Seawater invaded entire neighborhoods in 4-meter-high waves. Screams could be heard as far away as the central palace. In the Temple of Light, the high priest Atlan and 12 of his most loyal followers desperately tried to stabilize the central master crystal, a 7-meter-tall piece that pulsed erratically, alternating between blinding brightness and total darkness. "The fields are reversing," one of the technicians shouted. "It's as if the Earth itself is pulling the energy back." Moments later, the master crystal exploded, instantly vaporizing everyone in the temple and sending energized shrapnel slicing through anyone within a 200-meter radius. Meanwhile, at the docks, scenes of absolute panic unfolded. Thousands tried to board anything that floated. Boats designed for 20 people sank with 100 on board. Guards initially tried to maintain order, but soon abandoned their posts to save their own families. Amidst the chaos, acts of extraordinary courage were performed. An elderly captain, 67-year-old Mercon, managed to organize the orderly boarding of nearly 300 children onto 10 different boats, ensuring that each had at least one adult capable of navigating it. He himself remained behind. At 7:22, the first major eruption occurred, not from a traditional volcano, but from a fissure that opened in the very center of the city, where the majestic royal palace had once stood. A column of fire, ash, and steam rose more than a kilometer high. The temperature in the city center rose so high that the decorative metal on the statues melted. People died simply from breathing the superheated air. King Poseidon IV and his closest entourage had taken refuge in the underground crystal chamber, designed specifically for emergencies, believing themselves safe. But as engineers attempted to activate the escape system, seawater mixed with lava forced its way through microscopic fissures. The temperature rose from 30 degrees, 88 degrees, to 140 degrees, 30 degrees, in a matter of seconds. No one survived. On the surface, the devastation reached biblical proportions. Of the 10 crystal towers that defined the Atlantean skyline, 7 had collapsed completely. The remaining 3 emitted uncontrolled pulses of energy, creating atmospheric distortions visible to the naked eye like waves in the air itself. Where there had once been order and symmetry, there was now only chaos. At 10:47, the greatest tragedy struck. The outer protective ring, a marvel of crystalline engineering that had kept the sea at bay, finally gave way, not gradually but all at once. A 20-meter-high wall of water advanced on the city 805 kilometers away. Structures that had withstood the earthquakes were simply swept away. Of the approximately 170,000 inhabitants who awoke that morning in Atlantis, an estimated 130,000 died within the first 12 hours. In the hills to the west, a group of refugees watched the unthinkable unfold. Ilara, a 29-year-old scribe, described it on a clay tablet that would be found millennia later. The jewel of the world is being devoured by the sea. The waters do not act naturally. They seem ravenous, as if deliberately seeking to destroy every vestige of our civilization. The gods are not just punishing us. They are trying to erase the fact that we ever existed. As the day progressed, secondary tsunamis struck coastlines thousands of miles away. Egyptian navigators reported waves taller than 4 men crashing into Alexandria. On the Greek islands, entire coastal villages disappeared. Even on the coasts of the future Spain and Portugal, fishermen were surprised by sudden and inexplicable tides. At sunset, only the top of the Atlantean Acropolis remained above water, a tiny island where a metropolis had once stood, approximately 5 people. Stout survivors crowded this last refuge. Many were injured, all traumatized. As night fell, they saw something extraordinary. The submerged crystals continued to shine in the depths like fallen stars. At dawn on the second day, at 3:44, the final blow struck. The tectonic plate itself beneath Atlantis collapsed. The Acropolis, along with its survivors, did not sink gradually. It was swallowed in seconds by an underwater abyss that opened like a gigantic mouth. There were no screams, no time to realize what was happening. One moment they existed, the next they had been claimed by the ocean. Of the approximately 40,000 Atlanteans who managed to escape in boats during the first hours, less than 10,000 survived the gigantic storms that ravaged the Atlantic in the following days. Scattered in small groups, they reached distant shores, North Africa, Southern Europe, possibly even the Americas, carrying only fragments of the knowledge that once defined the most advanced civilization the world had ever seen. In less than 36 hours, Atlantis ceased to exist. Not just the city, but an entire culture, an unparalleled technology, a way of life that would never be recovered. The ocean now covered the place with more than 3,000 meters of water, and except for the scattered survivors, it was as if it had never existed, but its legacy and lessons would continue to echo through the millennia to come. And so, overnight, Earth's most advanced civilization became nothing more than an echo. Whispers and legends carried by survivors, scattered to the 4 winds. These Atlantean remnants arrived not as conquerors, but as traumatized refugees. People who had lost everything except the memories of a greatness no one would ever believe possible. Calamar, a 51-year-old low-ranking priest, arrived with 43 others on what we now know as the Moroccan coast. He carried with him something more precious than gold, a fist-sized knowledge crystal containing part of Atlantis's central library. For decades, he used this crystal to teach local children about advanced mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The natives considered him a god, but he knew the truth. He was merely the guardian of fragments of a much greater knowledge, now lost forever. In the Nile Delta, a group of Atlantean engineers found refuge among the early Egyptians. They could not recreate the wonders of their homeland. The necessary materials were lost. The master crystals lay at the bottom of the ocean, but they could teach principles. The oldest hieroglyphics contain symbols curiously similar to those used in Atlantean laboratories. The astronomical precision of the early pyramids, perfectly aligned with specific constellations, suggests knowledge that a nascent civilization would have been unlikely to develop on its own. Evidence of these survivors appears in unexpected places. The colossal statues of Tiahuanaco, Bolivia, use stone-cutting techniques that archaeologists still can't fully explain. The metallurgical knowledge of the Meccans appeared seemingly out of nowhere. European dolmens, enormous stone structures aligned with astronomical events, were built by people who supposedly had no writing or advanced mathematics. Most intriguing are the objects occasionally dredged from the ocean floor, artifacts that defy our understanding. In 1968, fishermen near the Baramas recovered a metal disc with indecipherable inscriptions and unexplained electromagnetic properties. In 1992, a submarine expedition found at a depth of 2,700 meters fragments of a crystalline material that, when exposed to light, emitted a faint, pulsating luminescence. Conventional scientists dismiss such discoveries as hoaxes or natural anomalies. But for those who study patterns in ancient civilizations, These are the distant echoes of lost knowledge. The Atlanteans left no pyramids or temples for us to study. Their land was completely reclaimed by the ocean, but they left behind something possibly more significant: ideas and concepts that emerged in distant civilizations that never had contact with each other. The myth of the universal flood exists in over 200 different cultures around the world. The idea of a lost golden age is nearly universal, and all these stories share common elements: an advanced civilization, a water-related cataclysm, lost knowledge. Plato didn't invent Atlantis. He preserved an account that was already ancient in his time. His detailed description, including precise measurements and specific structures, doesn't seem allegorical, but rather an attempt to document something that was already becoming myth. When he writes about concentric rings alternating land and water, he's describing an urban configuration ideal for controlling energy flows. When he mentions a strange metal, more precious than gold, he could be referring to the crystalline conductors that powered Atlantean technology. Most fascinating is how the Atlantean legacy may have shaped our own technological trajectory. The first experiments with electricity in the 16th century followed principles curiously similar to those described in ancient Hermetic texts that claimed to preserve knowledge of the ancients. Nikola Tesla, whose ideas about wireless energy transmission seemed decades ahead of their time, was obsessed with ancient texts and believed he was rediscovering lost principles, not inventing new ones. But perhaps the most important legacy of Atlantis is the warning it represents of a civilization that reached its technological peak, that dominated its environment to a critical point, and then collapsed, not from external invasion, but from imbalances of its own making. The parallel with our current situation is impossible to ignore. We too extract resources at an unsustainable rate. We too have fundamentally altered our environment. We too rely on increasingly complex and interconnected technological systems where failures at one point can cascade through the entire network. The difference is that our scale is global. There is no other continent to flee to if our systems collapse. A fragment of text allegedly translated from an Atlantean tablet found in ancient Egypt contains a disturbing warning. When we manipulate fundamental forces without fully understanding them, we are not masters but apprentices, playing with the tools of the gods. Nature does not punish, it simply restores balance, and this restoration can be merciless. The collapse of Atlantis was not just a disaster, it was a correction. A natural system responding to interference that had passed a critical point. And this brings us to the most pressing question. Are we today dangerously approaching our own point of no return? This question of whether we are approaching our own point of no return brings us to the most important question. Because you, yes, you who are watching, probably wouldn't survive a day in Atlantis. And what does this say about our own future? The truth is, you wouldn't just be technologically unprepared, you would be completely culturally out of place. For starters, your basic survival instincts would be useless. You know how to find food at the supermarket, not how to identify which crystals are safe to handle and which might explode with the wrong thought. Your modern education, even if it includes doctorates in physics or engineering, would be primitive by Atlantean standards. It would be like a smartphone expert trying to repair a warp drive. The skills needed to thrive in Atlantis seem almost mystical to us today. The ability to synchronize your own bioelectricity with crystalline systems, the intuitive knowledge of energy geometries, the expanded sensory perception to detect invisible fields. These weren't supernatural abilities to the Atlanteans. They were as basic as reading and writing. They are to us. 7-year-old children in Atlantis could sense energetic disturbances that our most sophisticated instruments could barely detect. Thane, a middle-caste Atlantean teacher, spent her days teaching children crystal breathing, a fundamental technique that allowed them to interact with basic technology. To her, it would be inconceivable that humans existed who were incapable of perceiving the energy fields around them. It would be like meeting someone who can't feel hot or cold. Even more disconcerting would be the complete integration between technology and spirituality in Atlantean society. There was no separation between science and religion, between engineering and art. The same priest who led solstice rituals also calibrated the master crystals. The same mathematics used to build temples was applied to irrigation systems. For a modern, fragmented and specialized mind, this unification of knowledge would be almost incomprehensible. And here's the most disturbing parallel. Just as you would feel lost in Atlantis, an Atlantean transported to our world would be equally shocked, not by our technology, which they would consider primitive, but by our disconnection, our inability to perceive the systems on which we depend, our willingness to destroy natural balances in exchange for momentary convenience. Look around you. We are not repeating the same patterns, extracting resources at an unsustainable pace, altering climate systems that we barely understand, building ever more powerful technologies without fully considering their ramifications, creating artificial intelligences whose decision-making processes we can no longer fully explain. Signs are everywhere. Islands of plastic in the oceans, extreme weather events occurring with increasing frequency, species disappearing at a rate 1,000 times greater than the natural rate. Technological systems so complex that no individual fully understands them. The parallel with the master crystals of Atlantis developing microscopic fissures is impossible to ignore. Scientist James Lovelock, creator of the Gaia hypothesis, said something profoundly relevant. The Earth is a self-regulating system. If we push the system too far from its equilibrium, it will find a new equilibrium, one that may not include humans. This could be exactly the lesson Atlantis didn't learn long ago, but here's the extraordinary turnaround. For all their advanced technology, for all their knowledge, the Atlanteans failed in something that is perhaps our greatest strength: adaptability. When their civilization collapsed, few knew how to survive without their crystalline systems. Extreme specialization made them vulnerable. The technology that freed them ended up imprisoning them. We, on the other hand, still preserve some flexibility. There are still communities that know how to live with minimal technology. There are still people who understand natural systems and respect their limits. And most importantly, we are beginning to recognize patterns of unsustainability in our own civilization. The same recognition that came too late for Atlantis. This is the true lesson of lost civilization. It is not that advanced technology is inherently destructive, but that any power without corresponding wisdom eventually becomes self-destructive. The Atlanteans mastered the how of energy manipulation, but lost the why and to what extent. When future archaeologists study our civilization, what will they find? Another Atlantis that shone brightly and then disappeared. Or the first global culture that managed to step back from the brink, that learned to balance technological advancement with sustainability. Physicist Geoffrey West, after studying collapse patterns in complex systems, came to a provocative conclusion. The same properties that make a system efficient and successful also make it vulnerable to total collapse. This may have been the fatal trap for Atlantis, and it may be for us unless we choose a different path. Human history is punctuated by civilizational collapses, but also by extraordinary rebirths. The knowledge preserved after the fall of Rome eventually flourished in the Renaissance. The ashes of World War II gave rise to unprecedented global institutions of cooperation. Our ability to learn from catastrophes may be our most adaptive trait. True power is not in completely avoiding collapse. This may be impossible. True power lies in our ability to preserve the essential, to carry the fire of knowledge through the dark ages, to rebuild not just replicas of the past, but improved, more resilient versions. If Atlantis truly existed, its greatest legacy would not be its technological marvels, but the lesson its end teaches us. Civilizations, like all living things, need to respect limits. They need to remain in balance with the natural systems on which they depend. They need to value wisdom as much as power. You probably wouldn't survive in Atlantis, and that's a good thing because you're not destined to live in the past, however glorious it may have been. You are here now at a critical moment in human history, when the choices we make will determine whether our descendants will study our civilization as a glorious peak or as another Atlantis, a wonder that shone briefly and then disappeared beneath the waves of time. The question is not whether Atlantis really existed, The question is whether we will learn his lesson in time, because in the end we are not fragile by chance, we are resilient by choice. And if you've come this far on this journey through the most enigmatic civilization that perhaps ever existed, have you already proven that you have something in common with the Atlanteans themselves? Insatiable curiosity and thirst for knowledge. Unlike them, however, you have the chance to share what you discovered. If this story about Atlantis stirred your imagination or made you reflect on our own civilization, leave a like. It's the simplest way to say that stories like this deserve to be told. Every comment you leave not only feeds the algorithm, but builds a community of people fascinated by the mysteries of the past that could shape our future. By the way, speaking of mysteries of the past, do you see this video appearing on the screen now? It explores another lost chapter of history that directly connects to what we have just discovered about Atlantis. It's almost like finding the missing piece of the puzzle. You really don't want to miss it. If you have subscribed to the channel, congratulations! You have just joined a secret society of people who, like the Atlantean monks, are preserving and spreading knowledge that many prefer to ignore. If you haven't signed up yet, it's just one click away to access historical revelations that challenge everything you thought you knew. Share with that friend who is always fascinated by alternative theories or who simply appreciates a good story. You'll essentially be doing the same thing as those few Atlantean survivors, passing on valuable knowledge before it's too late. See you in the next historical mystery.